Chapter 10 of The Adventures of Mabel by Harry Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10 The Giant's Castle. For a long time Mabel always took the same morning ride, going along the straight road that led to the little pig's red house, because she was afraid that she might get lost if she tried any new and unknown roads. But when she found that she was 6 years old, she felt that she could do things that she had never done before. And besides, she was growing tired of always riding over the same road and seeing the same things every day. So one beautiful morning she made up her mind that she would take a ride in a different direction, and try to see some parts of the country that she had never seen before. "I'm going a different way this morning, Grandma," she said as she went out of the house. "There's a road that goes to the left after you pass the kitty cats, and I'm going to ride that way." "Very well," said Grandma. "Only don't go too far. Be back to luncheon." "Oh, I'll be back in time," said Mabel, as she went into the barn and climbed on Rex's back for her new ride. Down the road she trotted, past the cross dogs' house, and over the bridge where the frogs lived, and past the mooly cows and the kitty cats, till she came to the road that branched off to the left. Mabel pulled on the left rein, and Rex, much to his surprise, turned into the new course. It was a winding road, going in and out of groves and small woods and passing between meadows that were bright with flowers. Mabel was so pleased with the change from the old sights that she went farther and farther, now making Rex trot, and now making him gallop. The sun shone bright, the air was soft and warm, and both Mabel and Rex enjoyed every minute of the time. At last, as she came out of a dense grove, Mabel saw before her a great broad river, shining like silver in the sunlight. Over it was a splendid stone bridge. She had never seen a river before, and she rode quickly upon the bridge and looked up and down the vast stream that flowed along with a million ripples among the arches. Then she crossed it and came to a road wider than any road she had ever seen before, and passing between fields fenced with stone. Each field was so large that she could scarcely see the fences on the other side, and here and there she saw men working, dressed in red from head to foot. "How strange!" said Mabel to herself. "It's like a picture book." On she rode, and still she saw those great wide fields and groups of men in red. At last she found 3 or 4 of the men working near the fence by the side of the road. So she went up to them and spoke to them. "Good morning, men," she said. "Who owns all these great fields?" The men looked at her and laughed. "Don't you know?" asked one of them. "Why, the giant owns them." Mabel laughed in her turn. "They're making fun of me," said she to Rex, and rode on. Pretty soon she found some more men near the roadside, all dressed in red like the others, and she stopped and spoke to them also. "Who owns these fields?" she asked, and the men answered with a look of surprise. "Why, the giant owns them, of course." "Dear me," said Mabel, "do they really mean it?" And then she asked, "What's the giant's name, please?" "Ha ha!" laughed the men. "Where have you been that you don't know about the giant? His name is Cormoran, and he lives in the castle over the hill." "Really?" said Mabel. "And why do you all dress in red?" "Oh, because red is the giant's favorite color," said they, "and all his people dress in red." "Well, well," said Mabel. "Where did you say his castle is?" "Straight ahead of you, over the hill," said they. "And is he a good giant?" asked Mabel curiously. "Well, pretty good," said one of the men rather doubtfully. "When he ain't put out, he's pretty good. But when he don't feel just right, we have to get out of his way, I can tell you." Mabel thought a moment. "Anyway," she said, "I'll just ride up to the top of the hill and take a peek. Nobody'll notice me, and I'd love to see a giant's castle, just for once." So she rode up the steep hill, and when she reached the very top, she gave a cry of wonder. There beneath her, in a beautiful green valley, was an immense great castle, so enormous that it seemed like a whole city. It was built of gray stone, and its roofs were peaked and covered with thick gold leaf, so that they glittered in the sunlight. Immense towers, each one as big as 10 church steeples, rose above the roofs, and on the central tower there floated an enormous red flag. "Isn't it wonderful?" cried Mabel as she looked. There was no one in sight anywhere, and Mabel was so astonished by the vast size of the castle that she forgot to be afraid, and she began to want to ride down the hill so as to see everything better. "I'll just go up to the front gate," said Mabel to herself. "If I see anyone coming out, I can turn around and make Rex gallop away quick. I'll do it." So down she rode into the valley, looking at the castle all the time with her mouth wide open. As she came nearer and nearer to it, she saw how large the blocks of stone were, and how immense the windows were, and she wondered more and more. It was stranger than anything in her picture books. Presently she reached the front entrance, and found a double door of iron studded with brass nails, and with great spikes on the top of it. The door was almost as high as an ordinary house, and Mabel wondered how anyone could be strong enough to push it open. She noticed that the lock was bigger than her whole body, and the keyhole wide enough for her to put her head in. "I wonder if I could peep through the cracks in the door," said Mabel to herself. And she was making Rex go nearer to the entrance when, all of a sudden, the great door flew wide open, and a man rushed out, all dressed in red from head to foot. Mabel gave a scream and tried to make Rex gallop off, but as soon as the man saw her, he gave a jump and caught at the bridle. "Hurrah!" he said. "What luck! Here's one now!" Mabel was terribly frightened. "Let me go! Let me go!" she cried, trying to pull the reins out of the man's hand. "No, no, don't go," he said. "Please don't go. Don't be afraid. Nobody's going to hurt you." Mabel looked at him carefully. He had a good face, and he did not seem like a cruel man. "Don't go," he repeated. "What do you want?" asked Mabel. "Why, I want you to come inside the castle for a little while. It won't do you any harm. If you don't come, why, I shall be eaten up by the giant at sundown." "How do you mean?" asked Mabel. "Well, I'll tell you," said the man. "You see, the giant's little girl has been dreadfully sick for a long time, and she's just getting better, but she can't go out yet, and has to lie on the sofa of the nursery all day long. She's terribly lonely without anyone to play with, and the giant thinks she'd get well faster if she could be amused. So he's just sent me out this morning to find a playmate for her, and said that if I didn't bring one back today, he'd eat me up. Now you're just what I want, a nice, good-looking little girl. So please come in and play with her a while, won't you?" "Oh," said Mabel, who was sorry for the man. "I'd like to oblige you, but I'm afraid of the giant." "Pooh!" said the man. "If you'll play with his little girl, he'll be as good as can be. Besides, you won't be likely to see him anyhow. Will you come in?" "And can I come away again when I want to?" asked Mabel. "Oh, yes. You just play a little while, and then say you'll come back again some other day, and they'll let you out." Mabel hesitated. She was very curious to see the inside of the castle, but she still felt a little afraid. "What is the little girl's name?" she asked. "Elsie," said the man, "and she's a real pleasant little girl, too. She'll be awfully glad to see you." "Well," said Mabel slowly, "I'll come in if you're sure they'll let me out as soon as I want to leave." "Oh, yes," said the man, who looked very happy now that he saw Mabel was going to go inside. "Thank you very much, little girl. Now I won't have to be eaten." He went up to the great double door and pulled a chain. Clang, clang, went a big bell, and the door flew wide open. Mabel looked in and saw a vast courtyard as large as a meadow. It was paved with stone, and the inner windows of the castle opened upon it. On one side was a great inner doorway with stone steps. A number of men dressed in red and looking like soldiers were standing about. They carried spears and had iron hats on their heads. The man led Rex into the courtyard with Mabel still seated in the saddle. "Who comes here?" asked one of the spearmen in red. "A playmate for the little Lady Elsie," said Mabel's man. The spearmen all bowed very low. "She is welcome," said they all. "Come, take care of her horse," said Mabel's man, "while I show her up to the nursery." So one of them lifted Mabel off Rex's back, and another took Rex by the head to lead him to the stable. "This way, little girl," said Mabel's man, and he started to show her toward the door on the right. Just at that moment a window above was opened with a loud bang. Mabel looked up, and her heart nearly stopped beating, for out of the window came an enormous face. It was the giant. His head was as large as a haystack, and was fringed by a long red beard. Tufts of red hair stuck out under his helmet, and his eyes were like great lamps. As he looked down into the courtyard, he opened his mouth and spoke, and his voice was that like the roll of thunder. "What have you there?" he bellowed, and Mabel nearly fainted when she heard his tremendous voice. "A playmate for the little Lady Elsie," answered Mabel's man. "Oh!" roared the giant, and he smiled a smile 6 feet long. He was evidently very much pleased. "Good," he continued. "Show her up to the nursery." And he banged the window down again and went away. "See," said the man, "he's all right now. He'll be pleased all the rest of the day. Come on." They went in through the doorway, where there was a tall flight of stairs. Each step was so high that Mabel could not stretch her little legs up from one to the other. But the man took her under the arms and boosted her a step at a time, till at last they reached the top of the stairs, where was a white enameled door. The man knocked on it and blew a silver whistle. "Come in," said a loud voice inside. The man pushed the door open and told Mabel to go in. She found herself in a long, high room about the size of a small church. It was a very pretty room. It was papered in white and gold, and carpeted with soft, fleecy rugs, and had a great many tall silvered vases here and there, filled with big clusters of roses and pinks, and at one end was a big bay window curtained with exquisite lace and rose-colored silk, through which the sunlight streamed in and flooded the room with warmth and color. At one side of the room was a sofa about as long as two ordinary beds, with pillows of pale blue silk and a pretty spread of silk and lace. There lay the giantess's little girl, looking eagerly toward her new playmate. She was about 8 feet tall, being small for her age, and she had dark hair and brown eyes. Her cheeks were pale, but she had a beautiful face which lighted up as she saw Mabel. "Oh, goody!" she said. "Now I've got someone to play with. But ain't you awfully little? Why, you must be a dwarf." "No, I'm not," said Mabel. "But you're awfully big. Why, they said you're a little girl." "So I am," said Elsie. "But you see I'm a giant. What's your name?" "Mabel." "And how old are you?" "6," said Mabel proudly. "Why, so am I," said Elsie. "I was 6 last week. Come over here, and I'll show you some of the toys that Papa gave me on my birthday. Here's my doll." And she pulled out a doll from under her pillow. It was as large as Mabel herself. "And here's my toy horse," she said, pulling out from behind her a wooden horse about the size of a Shetland pony. "My, what big toys!" said Mabel. "Oh, do you think so?" asked Elsie. "Here's my tin soldiers. Here's my jack-in-a-box. Here's my new tea set." The tin soldiers were so heavy that Mabel could not lift them. The plates in the tea set were as big around as the top of a table. "How funny!" said Mabel, laughing. Just then a loud rustling and flapping made Mabel look behind her, and then she noticed a sort of bird cage as big as a chicken coop. In it was a great yellow bird rustling its wings. "Oh!" said Mabel. "Where did you get the eagle?" "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Elsie. "That isn't an eagle. That's my canary." Mabel laughed too. "It must be awfully queer to be a giant," she said. "Don't you feel too big sometimes?" "Oh, dear, no," said Elsie. "You see, I was born big, and I should think you'd feel much too little." "Not a bit," said Mabel. "You see, I was born little." "We'll have some candy," said Elsie. "My papa gave me a lot of it on my birthday, but I can't eat any till I get well, so I'll give you some." She drew out a pasteboard box from under the sofa. It was about the size of a packing box, and when she took the lid off, Mabel saw that it was lined with lace paper. Elsie took out a great lump of something that was brown in color, and set it on the floor beside Mabel. It came up to her knees. "What's that?" she said, looking at it curiously. "Ha, ha!" laughed Elsie. "Why, where have you been all your life? Didn't you ever see a chocolate cream drop?" "Gracious!" cried Mabel. "Is that a chocolate cream drop? Why, just that one would last me for 2 weeks." She tried to lift it up to her mouth to take a bite, but it was too heavy. Then she got down on her knees and tried to bite a piece out of it, but it was so big that she couldn't get hold of it with her teeth. Elsie looked on and laughed as though she would never stop. "I can't get any," said Mabel, who had only succeeded in smearing the end of her nose with chocolate. "And I love chocolate cream drops, too." "Dear me," said Elsie. "There must be some way of doing it. I know. Look in my toy box by the table, and you'll find a toy axe." Mabel found the toy axe, which was as large as an ordinary hatchet, and with this she knelt down on the floor and began to chop the chocolate cream drop. Pretty soon she had chopped off some good-sized chunks, small enough to be held in the hand. They were delicious, and she sat on the floor eating them, while Elsie shook with laughter at the idea of taking an axe to a chocolate cream drop. Just at that moment a noise was heard in the hall. Bump, 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 making the very walls tremble. "What's that, Elsie?" asked Mabel, with her mouth full of chocolate cream. "Oh, that's my papa coming downstairs," said Elsie, and sure enough, a moment later the nursery door opened, and Cormoran strode into the room. Mabel knew that he would not do her any harm, but still she could not help feeling a little startled at being so near to a giant. He seemed bigger than ever, in the small nursery. He wore enormous jackboots and carried a long knife by his side. As he came in, he looked at the children. When he saw the toys scattered over the floor and Mabel eating the chocolate cream drop, and when he noticed how Elsie laughed and how bright her eyes were and how her pale cheeks were once more flushed with color, his great face beamed with happiness, and he smiled hugely. "Having a good play, are you?" he asked in his thunderous voice. "That's right, play away! I haven't seen you looking so gay in many a week, Elsie." Then turning to Mabel, he said, "You're a good little girl. You must stay with us." "Oh, no, I really can't stay," cried Mabel. "My grandma would be so frightened. But I'll come back and play with Elsie as often as you want, for I love her, and we're having splendid fun together." "Well, well," said the giant, "I won't keep you. Only don't forget to come back every few days. And when you get ready to go to-day, just stop at my door on your way out, and I'll give you something for a keepsake." And with these words he went out of the nursery and shut the door. The children played together a long while, until Mabel suddenly remembered that it must already be after her luncheon time. So she told Elsie that she would have to go. "Well, good-bye, dear," said Elsie. "Don't forget to come again soon. And be sure you stop at my papa's door at the other end of the hall." They kissed each other, and Elsie rang a bell for the man in red to show Mabel the way out. First he took her to the giant's den and knocked on the door. "Come in," said a great voice, and the door opened, and Mabel found herself in the den. It was the largest room she had ever seen. The walls were hung with clubs of every kind, plain clubs and spiked clubs, and clubs with great knobs on them, besides spears, swords, knives, axes, and pikes. A long table was covered with books, each one as large as a door. Mabel, who had just learned to read a little, spelled out the names on the backs of two of them, The Life of Og and Men I Have Eaten. There were also a good many pictures on the walls, showing other giants who were probably the relatives of Cormoran. "Well, little girl," said the giant kindly, "so you're going home, are you? I want to give you a little present." So he drew out a large drawer in the table and told Mabel to take anything she liked. There were long strings of bright stones, blue and red and white, and even in the dark drawer they gleamed and shone as if they were darting sparks of fire. Each one was as big as a robin's egg. "Have a necklace?" said the giant, pulling out a dozen or more of them. "No, thank you," said Mabel. "My grandma says that it isn't nice to wear glass." "Ha, ha, ha!" roared the giant, bursting into laughter so loud that Mabel stopped her ears up with her fingers. He was greatly amused to hear Mabel call the stones glass, for they were really the largest and finest gems in the world, sapphires and rubies and diamonds. "Well, then have a ring," said he, still chuckling, and he showed her a box full of rings. "I'm afraid they're too large," said Mabel, for the smallest was as big around as a hoople. "Bless me," said the giant, "so they are." He seemed quite disturbed at not being able to give her anything. Finally an idea came into his head. He took out a great coil of frosted gold wire and began to braid it into a belt. He worked quickly, and soon he had made a very quaint and curious band of an odd pattern. "There," he said, as he slipped it around her waist. "Oh, thank you," cried Mabel, who was no longer afraid of him. "Isn't that lovely? Good-bye." "Good-bye," said he. "Don't forget to come again." Mabel went out into the hall, and the man in red helped her down the big steps into the courtyard. As she passed through the door, the great bell of the castle clanged, and the spearmen stood in line and saluted her. One of them brought out Rex, who had a fine dinner of giant oats. The man in red lifted Mabel to the saddle. The outer gate flew open. She waved her hand to the men and spoke to Rex, and away she galloped out into the road, never stopping until she had passed the stone bridge, the kitty cat's house, the mooly cow's, the frog's bridge, and the cross dog's, and come clattering into her own yard. It was already 4 o'clock, and Grandma had begun to fear that Mabel was lost. "Why, where have you been, Mabel?" asked she. "You didn't come back to luncheon, and I was quite worried about you. Were you lost?" "Oh, no," said Mabel, "but I've had such a good time that I forgot all about luncheon. You see, I went down a new road, and there I met a little girl, and played with her in her own nursery. She is a very good little girl, Grandma, and I'm going back to see her before long." "What is her name?" asked Grandma. "Oh, Elsie," answered Mabel. She had lots of toys and candy and things." Just then Grandma noticed the golden belt that glittered in the sunlight around Mabel's waist. "Why, Mabel," she cried, "where did you get that belt? What a beautiful pattern! and it looks as bright and fine as real gold." "Oh," said Mabel, "the little girl's papa gave it to me. You see, the little girl has been sick and wanted someone to play with, so her papa was very glad that I came." "Dear me," said Grandma, "I wonder who these people are." But Mabel did not say anything about their being giants, for she knew that Grandma would be dreadfully frightened if she heard that her little girl had been to visit a giant's castle. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Adventures of Mabel by Harry Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter number 11. The Brownie Jelly. One day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mabel put on her sunbonnet and took a little basket and went down into the woods to pick blackberries. It was getting to be rather late in the summer, and the berries were not very plenty, so that she had to go a long way into the woods before she found any bushes that were filled. But at last she came upon a great thicket full of briars, but with bushes on which the ripe berries were so thick that she cried out with joy when she saw them. Behind the thicket rose an enormous rock, half hidden by vines and creepers. Mabel got down on her hands and knees, picking away as hard as she could, and when she had gathered all the berries on the outside of the thicket, she began to creep along the ground in the midst of the bushes, avoiding the sharp briars, and reaching up for the berries that hung above her head. Further and further she crept, like a little mouse in a haystack, and by the time she had crawled through to the rock her basket was nearly full. At this moment, however, she saw to her surprise that the base of the rock, which had been hidden by the bushes, was not solid, but that there was a large hole in it which seemed to have been hollowed out of the stone. It was an opening about half as high as Mabel herself, and appeared as though it led into a sort of dark tunnel in the rock. "Well," said Mabel, "that looks like a kind of cave. I wonder if it is." She peered into the hole, but it was too dark for her to see what was inside of it, so she thought that she would crawl in just a little way to find out how far into the rock it went. In she crept on her hands and knees, and as soon as she had got inside she discovered that the hole, instead of growing smaller or coming to an end, was even larger than it had looked. She felt of the sides and of the top with her hands, and found that by crawling a little further she could stand on her feet without touching the rock overhead. "Dear me," she said, greatly excited, "it's like a hall in a house. I wonder where it leads to." She thought at first that it might be the den of some wild animal, so she whistled the call 2 or 3 times, but got no answer. "I'll go on," thought she. "I can easily find my way out." For when she turned around she could still see the mouth of the cave and the sunlight shining beyond it. So on she walked, putting her feet down very carefully at every step, for fear she should fall into some hole. And pretty soon she came to a sharp turn in the passageway, where she had to go around a corner. As soon as she had turned the corner, she found a very broad, high passage, and at the end of it a long ray of light, like a bright pencil, shone far out into the darkness. It seemed to come through a little hole in the rock at the end of the tunnel. "What's that?" thought Mabel. "I'll walk very softly up to it and see." A dozen more steps brought her to the chink through which the light was streaming. She groped about the wall with her little hands, and found that it felt like a great stone door, while the chink was exactly the shape of a keyhole. As she stood there she could hear voices on the other side of the door, and now and then the sound of laughter and the strains of gay music. She was ever so curious, and was just putting up her head to peek through the keyhole, when all of a sudden she sneezed, a loud, long sneeze. Instantly, even before she had stopped sneezing, the door in front of her flew wide open. A flood of brilliant light poured out into the dark tunnel, and in the doorway Mabel saw a funny little figure standing before her. He had a queer peaked cap on his head, and a comical merry look on his face, and Mabel knew at once that he was a brownie. When the brownie saw her he looked very much surprised, and then began to laugh. "Gracious goodness!" cried he. "A little girl! How in the world did you get here?" "I crept through the bushes after berries," said Mabel, who was very much amused by the brownie's looks, "and I found a big hole in the rock and followed it along until I reached this door." "Well, well, well," said the brownie. "Come in." He stepped aside. Mabel walked through the doorway, and he shut the door after her. She found herself in a noble hall whose walls were panelled with silver, and whose ceiling was carved out of solid gold. Here and there clusters of what looked like great pearls were embedded in the golden ceiling, and from them shone the soft, clear light that filled the hall with its radiance, and gleamed on the silver panels and the yellow gold. All about were easy chairs of some rich white stuff, and huge cushions of velvet were placed along the sides of the hall. On them were seated half a dozen brownies, chattering away to each other, while in the middle of the hall a number of them were playing tag and leapfrog. Now and then lively music could be heard, played by a band of musicians whom Mabel could not see. When they saw Mabel, all the brownies stopped talking and playing, and crowded about her with their bright little faces full of curiosity. "A little girl!" they all shouted. "How did you come here?" Mabel told them all about it, and as she told them, they laughed and chuckled. She looked at them very carefully all the while, and she could remember having seen pictures of most of them in one of her books. There was the soldier brownie, and the sailor brownie, the policeman brownie, the dude brownie, the Chinese brownie, the Indian brownie, and the Irish brownie. But there were many new brownies that she had never heard anything about. When she had finished telling them how she had found her way into the cave, they all laughed again, and every one of them shook hands with her, and told her to make herself at home. "Sit down on the big cushion near the wall," said the brownie who had opened the door for her. "I've got to go and tell the king about your being here, and see what he has to say. But I'll be back soon, so have a good time with my brothers while I'm gone." Mabel sat down and watched them as they romped about, playing all sorts of tricks on each other, and laughing at every kind of joke, while the music played the gayest tunes. Pretty soon a waiter brownie came up to Mabel with a gold tray on which stood a silver jar. It was open, and was full of something amber-colored, in which there was a small gold spoon. "What's this?" asked Mabel, as she looked at it. "Jelly," said the waiter brownie. "Taste it. It's awfully good." Mabel took the golden spoon and put a little of the jelly in her mouth. "Ah!" she said, rolling up her eyes. It was the most delicious morsel that she had ever tasted in her life. It was like all the loveliest kinds of ice cream blended together, with pounded almonds and chocolate and strawberries, and it melted away on her tongue like honey. "Ah!" said Mabel again, and she took the jar into her lap and began eating the jelly slowly to make it last as long as she could. When she had finished, she scraped the bottom and then gave a great sigh of satisfaction. Just at this moment, the brownie whom she had first seen came back into the hall and beckoned to her. "The king wants to see you," he said. "Come with me, and I'll show you the way." He led her out through a short passage and into a room that was the most splendid room that she could ever have imagined. It was not very large, but the walls were encrusted with thousands of great uncut rubies of the richest red. The ceiling was starred with diamonds, and the floor was of beaten gold. At one end of the room the brownie king was sitting on a low throne. He was a jolly-looking old brownie, dressed all in scarlet, with a crown on the back of his head. Beside him was a pipe with a long stem encrusted with diamonds, and on a table near him stood a large gold mug with a lid. His brown eyes twinkled when he saw Mabel. "Aha, little girl," said he. "Come in. I want to see you, for you're the only little girl who ever found her way to our house, and no little girl will ever be able to do it again. So I want you to have a good time while you're here, and carry away many pleasant thoughts of the brownies. Did you enjoy yourself in the great hall?" "Oh, yes, King," said Mabel. "I had a splendid time there, and some jelly." "What's your name, dear?" asked the king. "Mabel." "Well, Mabel," said he, patting her on the head, "you must let me give you something to remember the brownies by." Then he turned to Mabel's guide and continued, "Show Mabel into the treasure room, and let her choose any one thing that she likes for a present to take home with her." Then he took a golden key from his belt and gave it to the brownie, saying, "Go with him, Mabel, and select your present, and when you have done so, come back and say good-bye to me." The brownie took the key from the king and bowed, and then Mabel followed him out of a second door. They went through several long narrow halls and a dark passageway that twisted and turned in different directions, till they came to a thick stone door with a big lock and having an iron ring on the outside. "Here's the treasure room," said the brownie, as he thrust the key into the lock and turned it. Then he pulled the iron ring. The door slowly opened, and he and Mabel went in. Mabel gave a cry of wonder and delight. The treasure room was an immensely long hall, filled with thousands of beautiful things piled up to the very ceiling. Great cases stood about crammed with everything that anyone could ever want. And there were also tables covered with all sorts of treasures. Toys, picture books, lovely dresses, silk, satins, velvets, mountains of candy of every kind and color. Knickknacks, paintings, curious carvings, bric-a-brac, jewels, and precious stones, ornaments, everything beautiful that anyone could imagine. All were in that wonderful room. "Oh, oh!" cried Mabel again, her eyes sparkling with delight. "What delicious things!" "Yes, they are pretty," said the brownie, smiling at her excitement, "and you must choose something for yourself as a present from the king." "May I really choose anything I want?" asked Mabel. "Yes, any one thing," said the brownie. "What shall it be?" "Oh, I must look around first," said Mabel, and she began to move about slowly among the heaps of treasures. Piled up against the sides of the room were great bags of gold. The brownie told her what was in them. "Oh, I don't want any gold," said Mabel carelessly, and the brownie laughed a little to himself. The first thing that she stopped to look at was a case filled with clusters of the most exquisite pearls strung into necklaces upon silver thread. Each pearl was as large as a pea, and had a soft lustrous gleam that made the whole necklace look like a string of globed lamps turned low. "Oh, how pretty!" cried Mabel. "They'd be just lovely to wear with my party dress. I'll try one on." So she tried one of the necklaces on. I think I'll take this," said she. "All right," said the brownie. But just at that moment Mabel's eyes caught sight of a dress hanging on a silver nail near by. It was made of pale rose-colored silk, covered with lace so fine that it looked as though it had been made by the fairies, and tiny knots of rose-colored ribbon were fastened at the shoulders and the waist. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried Mabel. "And it's just the right size for me. May I take this instead of the necklace?" "Of course," said the brownie. Mabel took the dress down from its nail and held it on her arm, passing her fingers over the lace and smoothing out the bows. "I think I'll take this," said she slowly. But just then she heard the sound of the most beautiful music by her side, and when she turned to look she found that it came from an ivory box. "It's a magic music box," said the brownie. "It plays all the tunes in the world. All you have to do is to pat the lid 3 times, and say what you want it to play, and it will play it till you pat it again." It was a very small box, but it played like a whole orchestra, now softly and sweetly like a fairy lullaby, and then full and strong like a great military band with drums and trumpets and cymbals, and then again its music was like that of flutes and harps and violins. "Oh, that's what I want," said Mabel. "Never mind the dress." She raised the box from the table and patted it to make it stop, and then she patted it again and told it to play the Lizard's Call. All at once it began playing it, first simply, and then with all sorts of changes to the sound of little silver bells and tinkling triangles. "Yes, I'll take that," said Mabel, and she was turning around to go when just behind her she saw what at first she took to be a little girl of about 3 years old sitting on a small velvet sofa. "Why, who's that?" gasped Mabel, greatly surprised. "That's a doll," said Brownie, "and I think you never saw one like it before. It can talk and laugh and cry and walk." "Can you talk?" asked Mabel of the doll. "Oh, yes," said the doll, smiling. "I can say 100 words." "Dear me," said Mabel, "how strange." She put the music box down and lifted the doll off the sofa and set it upon the floor. It walked up and down 2 or 3 times and then said, "Put me back, please." "Well, I never!" said Mabel. "There's a whole trunk of clothes that go with the doll," said the brownie. "Oh, that's what I want," said Mabel. "Would you like to go with me, Dolly?" "Yes, indeed," said the doll. "It's stupid sitting here all alone." "Well," said Mabel, "I think I'll take you." And then she was looking about for the trunk of clothes when down at the end of the hall she noticed, for the first time, a sort of house standing among a perfect forest of swings, seesaws, and runarounds. "Why, what's that?" she asked. "Oh, that's a doll house," said the brownie. "Want to see it?" "Yes," said Mabel, and she hurried down to where it stood, leaving the doll, who called after her once or twice and then laughed. Mabel reached the doll house. It was a real house with 12 rooms, each one almost large enough for Mabel herself to sit in. The front of the house had real glass windows with lace curtains, 2 front doors and a doorstep, besides a little doorbell, and the whole front swung open on hinges and showed the inside of the house when you rang the bell. Each of the 12 rooms was fully carpeted and furnished, even to the pictures on the walls, and the clocks on the mantels, and the soap dish in the bathroom. A bird cage with a canary that really sang hung in the sewing room. There was a piano in the parlor, and in the kitchen was a stove with a fire in it that blazed up when you touched a knob. A pump in the sink pumped real water, and when the fire in the stove was going, real smoke came out of the chimneys at the top of the house. The bedrooms had lovely little beds with pillows and pillow shams. The dining room had a full set of dishes on the sideboard. The garret was stored with trunks and curious things. And the cellar had a coal bin and a woodpile, just as in a real house. "Oh, that's the best yet!" cried Mabel, clapping her hands. "But it's so big that I couldn't carry it home." "Oh, yes, you could," said the brownie. "You press the little knob in the roof, and the house shuts up by magic, and makes a little package that you can carry in one hand. And when you press the other knob on the doorstep, it all opens out again, just as you see it now." "Well, then, this is what I will really take," said Mabel, and she walked around the house, looking at it from all sides. As she went behind it to see if there was a back door, she saw against the end of the treasure room a great pyramid of little silver jars, each one having a gold spoon tied to it by a silver wire. "Ah!" said Mabel, as she looked at the jars, "I know what's in them. It's brownie jelly." "Yes," said the brownie, "just like what you had in the great hall." "Yes," said Mabel slowly, and her eyes wandered away from the dollhouse to the jars of jelly. She remembered how delicious the jelly was, how it tasted like all the loveliest kinds of ice cream blended together with pounded almonds and chocolate and strawberries, and as she thought of it, her little mouth watered and she smacked her lips. "It was awfully good," said she. "Yes," said the brownie. "It was the best thing I ever tasted in my life," said she. "Yes," said the brownie. "I can only have one thing, can I?" "Yes," said the brownie. Mabel stood first on one foot and then on the other foot, and put her finger in her mouth, and looked hard at the dollhouse, and then at the jars of brownie jelly. "Well," she said at last, "do you know, I think I'll take a jar of brownie jelly." And she snatched one of the silver jars from the top of the pile. Then Brownie laughed so that he could hardly speak. Mabel blushed, but she kept a tight hold on the jar. "Are you really going to keep it?" asked the brownie. "Yes," said Mabel firmly, "and I think I'll go now. Please, Brownie, will you take my hand and lead me out of the room? I want to shut my eyes so that I won't see any of the other things, for fear I should change my mind." The brownie laughed again, and finally he took some silver paper and wrapped up the jar and its spoon into a neat little package. Then he led Mabel out of the treasure room into the passage, and locked the door. They went back through the winding passage and the halls till they came to the room where the Brownie King was sitting on his throne. "Aha!" said he when he saw Mabel. "So you're back again. Did you choose a present?" "Yes, King," she said, "and I thank you very, very much." "And what did you choose?" asked he, smiling. "I think I can guess. Was it the talking doll?" "No, King, it wasn't the doll." "What? Not the doll? Well, well, then it must have been a beautiful necklace." "No, King," said Mabel, "it wasn't a necklace." "Then it was the music box." "No, King," said Mabel, "it wasn't the music box either." "What? Why, I don't understand. Perhaps it was a lace dress." "No," said Mabel. "Oh, yes," said the King, "I remember. Of course, it was the dollhouse." "No," said Mabel, "it wasn't the dollhouse." The King nearly fell off his throne, he was so surprised. "Then for goodness' sake," he said, "tell me what it was." "Well," said Mabel, looking down, "it was a jar of brownie jelly." The King lay back on his throne and shook with laughter till Mabel thought he would fall to pieces. "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" he roared. "A jar of jelly? A jar of jelly?" "Yes," said Mabel, "it's the best thing I ever tasted." "Ha, ha, ha! A jar of jelly!" cried he again. "Well, well, you're a real human little girl, aren't you? A jar of jelly!" Then he stooped down and patted her head and said, "Well, good-bye for now, Mabel. I'm sorry to have you go, for you've given me such a good laugh. But no little girls ever come here, nor any other human beings, so I suppose I shall not see you again. Good-bye." And then he began laughing once more, and the last thing that Mabel heard him say was, "A jar of jelly." She went back into the great hall to say good-bye to the other brownies, who all shook hands with her and patted her on the head. And then the soldier brownie brought a torch and said that he would light the way for her out of the cave. So the great door was opened again, and Mabel went out into the dark tunnel, the soldier brownie going ahead of her with the torch. When they had turned the corner and could see the daylight glimmering at the entrance of the cave, the soldier brownie in his turn shook hands with Mabel, said good-bye, put out the torch, and quickly disappeared around the corner. Mabel heard him going back to the stone door, and soon she heard it open and shut again. And then she crept out of the dark hole, through the thicket and the blackberry bushes, and ran home as fast as she could, leaving her sunbonnet and her basket of berries on the ground, but hugging the jar of jelly tight in her arms. Grandma was sitting on the veranda when Mabel ran up, all out of breath. "Oh, Grandma, Grandma!" she cried. "Where do you think I've been?" "Why, down in the woods, I suppose," said Grandma. "Yes, but where else?" "I'm sure I can't guess," answered Grandma. "Well, Grandma, I've been in the Brownies' home, visiting the Brownies." Then she told the whole story just as it has been told here. And when she finished, she cried out, "There now! What do you think of that?" Grandma smiled and patted her little girl's head. "I think," she said, "that somebody fell asleep in the woods and had a beautiful long midsummer dream." "Oh, no!" cried Mabel. "I didn't dream a word of it. It really, really happened to me. And I was just as wide awake as you are, Grandma. Truly, truly." "Well, well, Mabel," said Grandma, "of course you think you saw all these strange things. But there are really no brownies nowadays outside of picture books, so you see you must have dreamed it." "Did I dream this, Grandma?" asked Mabel, suddenly holding up the package wrapped in silver paper. Grandma looked surprised and took the package and unrolled it. Out came a beautiful little silver jar with a silver lid and a gold spoon fastened to it by a bit of fine silver wire. On the top of the lid was carved a picture of the Brownie King and his crown upon his head, and the same picture was cut on the handle of the spoon. Grandma's eyes opened very wide. She did not speak for a long time, and then she said, "It's all very curious, Mabel, and I will not speak about it just now. It is time for you to have your supper and be put to bed. But tomorrow morning after breakfast, I will go with you to the woods, and you can show me the place where you found the entrance to the cave." So the next morning Grandma and Mabel went together down into the woods, and Mabel led her to the thicket of blackberry bushes. Sure enough, there lay Mabel's sunbonnet just where she had left it the day before. In the bushes they also found the basket nearly full of berries. Mabel showed Grandma how she had crawled through the bushes to the great rock. "I'm pretty old to creep on the ground," said Grandma, after peering into the thicket, "but I think I'll try it, just for once." So she actually got down on her hands and knees and crept in among the bushes, just as Mabel had done. But when she reached the rock on the other side, she found no opening, for an enormous stone had been wedged into the hole, so that hardly a crack was left. Grandma took both hands and tried to move it, but it was too heavy and was wedged in too tight, and when she gave it up, she heard a little laugh on the other side of the stone. She crawled back to where Mabel was waiting. "There's no hole now," she said. "It's been stopped." "Yes," replied Mabel, nodding her little head wisely. "The King Brownie said that no one would ever get in again." They walked home together, and Grandma kept very silent about it all. That day Mabel gave her a taste of the brownie jelly, and every day she herself ate just one spoonful of it till it was all gone, and then she put the empty silver jar and the spoon on the shelf in her own room, to remind her of the time when she had visited the Brownies. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Adventures of Mabel by Harry Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, The Rescue of Jack. After her first visit to the giant's castle, Mabel went there regularly twice a week. She and Elsie became great friends, and as Elsie grew stronger, they began to plan for the time when she and Mabel could go out into the fields and have a picnic. But as yet, she was not able to get any further than the courtyard. It was just at this time that something happened which I'm now going to tell. Over the hill beyond the brook, where the frogs were, stood a small white house, and in it lived a little boy about 7 years old, named Jack. He had not lived there long, so that Mabel did not know him very well. But he had come to her house once or twice to see her and Walter, and they were getting to be pretty well acquainted. One day Mabel was sitting on the lawn playing with Towser, when Jack's father came by, walking very fast and looking anxiously in all directions as he walked. When he saw Mabel, he stopped and asked, "Have you seen anything of my little boy today?" "No," said Mabel. "He hasn't been here." Jack's father didn't wait to say anything more, but hurried on up the road. He had been gone about an hour, when back he came, still walking very fast and looking all about him. "Did you find him?" asked Mabel, as he passed by the gate. "No, and no one has seen him anywhere. I can't think what has become of him, for he's been away since 10 o'clock this morning, and it's now 2. He didn't come home at noon for dinner, and I fear that something has happened to him." "Well," said Mabel, "if I see him, I'll tell him that you are worried about him." "Thank you," said Jack's father. "And please ask everybody that passes if they have seen a little boy in velvet knickerbockers and a Scotch cap." And he hurried away in the direction of his own home. Mabel thought it over for quite a while, and then she felt that it would be a good thing for her to have Rex saddled and to ride along the roads, asking whether anyone had seen or heard of Jack. So presently she was galloping past the Cross Dog's house and the Frog's Brook, and just as she was near Jack's house, she saw the butcher riding along in his cart. "Have you seen anything of a little boy in velvet knickerbockers and a Scotch cap?" she asked him. "Yes," he said. "I saw him this morning, going down the road that turns to the left after you go some distance past the hill. I've just told his father so, and he's got a horse and has gone to look for him down that way." Mabel let Rex walk as she went along in the same direction. She thought that if Jack's father had gone down the road to the left, there was no need for her to go that way too. Yet she decided that she would ride slowly along to meet the two when they came back. So she went on through the woods and past the kitty cats, and then she reached the road that turned to the left. Just at that moment she heard the sounds of a horse's hoofs galloping in the distance, and she stopped Rex and waited. Nearer and nearer came the rider, and presently Mabel saw Jack's father riding a bay horse and galloping up the hill like mad. His head was bare, his face was as white as a sheet of paper, and he was lashing the horse, whose sides and legs were covered with dust and foam. "What's the matter?" called out Mabel, as he plunged into the main road, where she was sitting on Rex's back. He pulled up his horse for a moment. "Oh!" he cried, "it's terrible! I heard that Jack had gone down this way, and I rode after him till I crossed a big stone bridge, and found a lot of men all dressed in red and working in the fields. When I asked them if they had seen my little boy, they told me that they had, that he had strolled down the road, and that a great giant had found him and carried him off to his castle. I didn't know there was a giant in this country, but there is, and they say that my little boy is to be eaten for his breakfast tomorrow morning." "What are you going to do?" asked Mabel, who was greatly excited by this news. "Do?" he cried. "Why, I'm going to get all the men in the town to come, with guns and axes and hammers, and break into the giant's castle and get my boy out." "I'm afraid a giant is too big for you to fight," said Mabel. "He could step on you and kill you with one foot." "So the men in the road told me," said Jack's father, "but I don't care. I'll do what I can. I'll burn and chop and slash, and if he kills me, why, I'd rather die than live without my little boy." Mabel looked very serious. "Stop a minute," she said. "I want to tell you something. Don't try to break into the castle, but just wait and let me see what I can do. If you will, I promise that Jack shall not be hurt." Jack's father stared at her in astonishment. "What, you, a little girl?" "Yes," said Mabel. "I know what I can do, and I promise you to bring Jack safely home by sunset. Wait at your house and see." "But, Mabel," said he earnestly, "you mustn't go near the giant's castle. You are too little to know what a giant is. He is a fearful monster, and if he sees you, he will catch you and eat you at the same time as he eats my poor little Jack." Mabel smiled. "No," she said, "don't be afraid. I promise not to get into any danger, but I promise also to save Jack before sunset. Don't do anything till then." "Well," said Jack's father, "I couldn't get any men together before that time, so I'll promise you. But be sure you don't run into any danger. I don't want you to be eaten too." With these words he whipped his horse and galloped away again toward the town to see if any men would help him attack the giant's castle. When he had disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust, Mabel patted Rex on the neck and spoke to him. "Rex," she said, "we've got a long, hard ride before us, but I want you to do your best so that I can keep my promise and save poor little Jack." She shook the reins, and Rex bounded forward down the road to the left. He flew along like an arrow. His hoofs seemed scarcely to touch the ground, as he strained his head forward and dashed over the road. His mane streamed in the air, his neck quivered, and he galloped faster than he had ever done in all his life. "Good, Rex!" cried Mabel, as he sped along with a flight like a bird's. On they went over hill and dale, on, clattering through the grass and woods, thundering over the great stone bridge, on between the fields where the men in red were working, on, never stopping till they dashed down the last hill, and found themselves before Cormoran's huge castle, with its mighty towers, its gilded roof, and its massive gateway. Mabel tugged at the chain, and the great bell clanged. The gate flew open, and she clattered into the courtyard, where the red spearmen saluted her. "Here, take my horse, someone!" cried Mabel, as she slid to the ground. "Do you want to see the little Lady Elsie?" asked one of the men. "No," said Mabel, "I want to see the giant." The man hesitated a little. "You can't see him today," said he. "He's very much out of sorts. He's shut himself up in his den, and has given orders that no one is to disturb him." "I can't help it," said Mabel. "I must see him. Please help me up the stairs, someone." The man who had spoken bowed and led her through the doorway into the castle, and lifted her up the great steps, one by one, till she had reached the top, and then he turned and ran away as fast as he could. Mabel walked straight to the door of the den. Her heart beat very fast, yet she did not hesitate a moment, but beat on the door with the handle of her riding whip. "Who's that?" roared a terrific voice within. "It's me!" called Mabel, as loud as she could, but her voice was too weak and small to be heard through the thick door. "Who's that?" bellowed the giant. "Go away!" Mabel beat the door again. "Ha!" shouted Cormoran, and Mabel could hear him jumping up from his oaken chair. "Knock again, and I'll eat you up." Mabel was dreadfully frightened, but she raised her whip and beat the door again. In half a second it flew wide open with a crash, and Cormoran rushed to the entrance. He was a fearful sight. His tangled red hair stood out all over his head like a blaze of fire. His lips were curled up so as to show his great tusks, and his eyes rolled and glared furiously like those of some monstrous beast. "You shall die!" he howled, and then he saw that it was Mabel. "Please, Cormoran, I want to see you about something very much," said Mabel, in her soft little voice, which trembled with fear as she spoke. Cormoran looked at her a moment, and he seemed less angry, but his face still wore a scowl. "Well," he said shortly, "come in." Mabel went into the den and climbed up on a footstool. "What is it?" growled Cormoran. "Come, make a short story of it." "Please," said Mabel, folding her hands in her lap, "have you caught a little boy to-day?" "Yes," grunted Cormoran. "He's ordered for breakfast. What of it?" "Oh, Cormoran," pleaded Mabel, "please don't eat him. His father is wild about it. He says he doesn't want to live if you eat his little boy." "What do I care, whether he lives or not?" growled the giant. "But Jack's such a good little boy," said Mabel, "and he never did you any harm. You won't be so cruel as to eat him, will you?" "Why not? Little boys are good eating. Why shouldn't I eat him just as you eat pigeons? Pigeons never did you any harm." Mabel was in despair. She felt that she could say nothing to persuade the great hungry giant, but she resolved to try once more. "Cormoran," she said, "you know I've been here often and often, because you asked me to, and I've played with Elsie, and you said yourself the other day that I did more for her than anyone else. When I first came she was pale and so weak that she couldn't walk, and now she's so strong and well that next week she's going out of doors again, just as well as ever. You love her ever so much, don't you? Well, Jack's papa loves him just as much as you do Elsie, and how will he feel when he knows that his little boy is dead? Now, Cormoran, if you think I've done anything for your Elsie, let Jack go for my sake, because he is my playmate too. If you will, I will love it better than the gold belt or than anything else, and I'll never forget it. You will, won't you? Please do." The great giant looked down on the little figure sitting on the footstool, pleading so earnestly with two big tears in her eyes. For a long while he kept silent, but a great gleam of good nature came into his eyes. His face softened, and at last he said, "Well, Mabel, I'd do almost anything for you. Come." He took a great bunch of keys from his belt and strode out of the room to the staircase. Mabel ran after him as fast as her little legs could carry her, and he picked her up in one hand and bore her gently down the stairs. Then he unlocked a great iron door, behind which was a dark, narrow stairway with short, winding steps. "He's down here in the cellar," said Cormoran. They went down the narrow stairs together into the dimly lighted cellar. It was an enormous place about half a mile long, with huge stacks of wine barrels and casks of ale piled about. As soon as Mabel's eyes became used to the darkness, she saw a row of cells, each with a great iron door and a heavy lock. All of them were open but one. "He's in there," said the giant, pointing to the cell whose door was shut. Then he took a big key and put it into the lock and turned it. Mabel laid her head against the door, and then she heard a little voice inside the cell sobbing and crying. "Oh, don't eat me! Please don't eat me!" said the voice. It was Jack. "Will you let me open the door?" asked Mabel of the giant. "And please don't let him see you when he comes out. He'll be so frightened. As soon as I pull the door open, please hide behind the big piles of barrels." "All right," said Cormoran, smiling. Mabel knocked on the door with her little fist. "Jack!" she called. "Who's that?" said the voice inside the cell. "It's Mabel," answered she. "Oh, Mabel!" called the voice. "What are you doing here? Has the giant caught you too?" "No," said Mabel cheerily. "And don't be afraid, Jack. I'm going to open the door and let you out and take you home." Jack gave a shout of joy. Then Mabel took hold of the door with both of her hands and pulled with all her might. The door swung slowly open, and as Cormoran hid himself behind the barrels, out came Jack. "Oh, Mabel, Mabel!" he cried. "How did you get here, and how did you open the door?" "Never mind now, Jack. We must hurry home as fast as we can. Come." She led the way through the cellar, and Jack followed her, wondering. They went up the cellar stairs and out into the courtyard, where the men in red stood up and saluted Mabel with their spears. "Bring my horse out, please," said Mabel, "and be as quick as you can." They led out Rex and helped Mabel into the saddle. "Lift this little boy up behind me," said Mabel, and they did so. "Now, Jack," she said, "put your arms around my waist and hold on tight, and be careful not to fall off. Are you ready?" "Yes," said Jack, and Mabel spoke to Rex, and he started out of the courtyard, trotting till he reached the open road, and then breaking into a long gallop as he set his head toward home. Meanwhile, Jack's father had ridden about the country, and had collected all the men he could, to lead them against the giant's castle in case Mabel did not return by sunset. About 40 men had promised to help him, and he had gathered them all together into a company on the top of the hill near his own house. They now stood there, looking down upon the long stretch of road that wound around the other hills. Some of the men had guns, others had pistols, and some were armed with clubs and axes and pitchforks and crowbars and scythes. Behind the highest hill the great red sun was already beginning to set. "It's nearly time," said Jack's father to the men. "The little girl said that she would be back by sunset, and if she doesn't come, you may be sure that the giant has caught her and is going to eat her too." The men clashed their weapons and looked very fierce. "We'll save them both!" cried they. Jack's father kept his eyes on the sun. Lower and lower it sank behind the hill, until only the upper part of it could be seen. "It's almost gone," said he with a groan. "She's not coming back." "Listen!" cried one of the men. "I hear something." They all leaned forward to listen. A far-off sound like the beat of a horse's hoofs came faintly to their ears. "It's a horse!" cried one. "Look!" Far away in the distance a tiny cloud of dust could be seen. On and on, nearer and nearer it came, until they saw a black speck moving swiftly down the road, while the sound of galloping grew louder and louder. The men all strained their eyes. "It is a horse!" cried Jack's father eagerly. "Yes, and I see a little white figure on his back. It must be Mabel. Thank heaven she's not lost at any rate." Nearer and nearer came the horse, plunging along through the dust of the road. "Yes," called out one of the men, "and there's something else on his back, too. Beyond the little girl. What is it? Yes, why, it's Jack!" A tremendous shout went up from 40 throats. Every man flung his hat into the air, and next his weapon, all cheering, and shouting like mad. And then right into the midst of them, up the side of the hill, dashed Mabel, with Jack behind her, carried along by noble old Rex, who was covered with foam from head to foot. Mabel pulled him up, and he stopped, his flanks quivering and his nostrils panting. Jack's father rushed at his little boy, and snatched him from the horse's back, hugging him tight to his heart. The men swarmed around Mabel, and lifted her out of the saddle, and then 2 of them held her up high in the air, while the whole band formed a procession and began marching toward her home. They sang and cheered and shouted till the hillsides rang. Grandma heard the noise and came out to the gate. She saw 40 men all marching toward her, and on the shoulders of 2 of them she saw a little girl sitting with an arm about each of their necks. Behind them, another man was leading Rex by the bridle rein. "Why, what does all this mean?" cried Grandma. And for answer, the 40 men gave one great shout. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah! Mabel!" End of chapter. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. End of The Adventures of Mabel by Harry Peck.